Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun was past its peak, bleeding heat into the red stone walls of Dead Horse Canyon, and the buzzards were already circling above her. Gwenna Walsh lay twisted at the base of a narrow ravine, her left leg bent wrong, her dress torn and dusty, dried blood clinging to her temple. She was 30 years old, a widow, and she had stopped praying 2 hours ago. Her canteen was empty, her lips were cracked. And her traveling party, those cowards, had left her for dead when the Apaches rode up the ridge 3 mornings back, but they had not taken her. They had not even seen her, wedged between 2 boulders when her horse reared and threw her down into the canyon. Her call for help had gone unheard. But the silence that followed had been worse. She blinked up at the sun, too weak to lift her arm to shade her eyes. Then came the sound of hooves. At first she thought it was another trick of the heat, but it grew louder, steadier. A horse not at a gallop but walking. Someone was coming. The figure appeared at the edge of the canyon, tall, broad-shouldered, sitting atop a dun-colored gelding. Dust clung to his coat and a rifle was slung across his back. When he spotted her, he swung down fast, boots scrambling to find footing on the loose rock. "Ma'am," he called, voice low but urgent. "Can you hear me?" She tried to answer. Only a rasp came out. He slid down the last few feet, landing beside her with a grunt. His face was shadowed by his hat, but his eyes were sharp and worried. "Name's Waylon Shaw," he said, kneeling beside her. "You are alive, thank God. Let me take a look." She flinched when he touched her ankle. "You got a break here, bad one. You get thrown." She nodded, barely. "You been here long?" 3 days, she whispered. "They left me." Waylon's jaw tightened. "They left you out here?" She nodded again. "No water?" he asked. She shook her head. He stood. "You are not dying out here, not today." She saw the way he looked around, measuring the canyon walls and the steepness of the climb. "I will carry you every mile home," he said. Gwenna blinked up at him. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to. You are hurt and alone. That is enough." Then he bent down, arms slipping under her back and legs, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She gasped, pain flaring up her side. "I got you," he said, his voice gentler now. "I will be careful." He carried her up the steep slope with careful steps, sweat beading on his brow. At the top, he laid her down gently by his horse, then pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and held it to her lips. She drank, slow and grateful. "You got a home?" he asked. "No." "Was headed to Fort Lowell to take work. I was going to cook for the officers. I do not have family." His brow furrowed. "What about before that?" "My husband died in Kansas last year. Fever. We had a little farm, no children." She saw something shift in his eyes then, not pity, something quieter. "Respect, maybe recognition." "I have a place," he said. "Small cabin near the Santa Cruz River. I can get you there, fix that leg right." "You a doctor?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am, but I know how to splint a bone and make stew. My ma taught me decent." She let herself lean back. She was too tired to argue. And something about him, his voice, the way he moved, made her feel like she could close her eyes for just a minute. He splinted her leg with care, wrapping it with cloth from his saddlebag. Then he lifted her again, mounted the horse, and settled her in front of him, holding her steady with one arm. They rode slow. The sun sank low behind them, painting the sky in fire and rust. Gwenna's head rested against Waylon's chest, the steady beat of his heart thudding beneath her ear. She felt safe for the first time in days. They stopped at dusk. Waylon made camp beneath a patch of cottonwoods close to a creek. He built a fire, propped her leg up, and fed her spoonfuls of warm beans and salt pork. He said little, but she watched the way he moved, quiet, capable, careful with every gesture. When she began to drift, he laid his blanket beside her and sat with his back to the fire, rifle across his lap. She opened her eyes once in the night and saw him keeping watch, his silhouette still and strong against the stars. By morning, they were back on the trail. It took them 3 days to reach his cabin, a small place, tucked between the river's edge and a long stretch of mesquite trees. The porch sagged a little and the roof could use patching, but it was clean, solid, and surrounded by quiet. Waylon carried her inside and laid her in a proper bed. Then he set about boiling water, washing her wounds and grinding willow bark for the pain. "You live here alone?" she asked, watching him stir something on the stove. He nodded. "Was not always alone. My younger brother died last year, snakebite. He was the only kin I had left. She did not ask more. She understood grief too well to press. The days passed slow and steady. He made her tea, read aloud from a worn book when the pain was bad, and helped her to sit up once the swelling in her ankle eased. She noticed the way he always looked at her when she spoke, like her words mattered. And she found herself looking at him longer, too, at the way his eyes softened when she smiled, the way his voice grew warmer each evening. One night, as he helped her settle back against the pillows, she reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said. "You do not owe me thanks. I owe you my life." He looked down at their joined hands. "You are not just a rescue to me, Gwenna," her breath caught. "What am I, then?" He looked at her, steady and sure. "You are someone I want to know, someone I think about when I wake up." "I do not know how it happened, but I feel it." She squeezed his hand. "So do I." He leaned forward, hesitated, then brushed a kiss to her forehead. It was gentle, but it sent a warmth through her chest that made her eyes sting. That night she slept soundly. And for the first time in a long while she dreamed of staying. The first time Gwenna stood on her own in Waylon's cabin, the floor felt like it might tip sideways beneath her. She braced herself against the edge of the hearth, fingers pressed to the warm stone until her balance steadied. Waylon stayed quiet, seated at the table whittling a length of mesquite into a spoon. He didn't move to help her, didn't offer praise, just watched, hands busy, waiting in case she needed him. "I can manage," she said, her voice still rasped from disuse but steadier now. "I know," he answered, not looking up. "That's why I ain't hovering." She let herself smile just a little. The air inside the cabin smelled of lye soap and old cedar, and after weeks of being still, her body ached to move even if it meant pain. She reached for the tin cup near the basin and filled it with water from the pitcher, her grip careful. "Do you ever go into town?" she asked. "Not unless I have to. Bisbee's a long ride and I prefer quiet." "You don't get lonely." He set the spoon down, leaned back in his chair. "Used to it. After a while you learn how to fill the silence." She turned toward him, the cup still in her hands. "I don't think I ever did. Not really." He studied her a while, arms folded over his chest. "You miss your farm, not the land," she said. "I miss knowing where I belonged." The wind picked up outside, making the shutters knock faintly against the window frame. Waylon rose and added a split log to the stove, then crouched to poke at the coals. Gwenna watched him move, deliberate, efficient, as if every gesture had been practiced 100 times. "You could stay," he said without turning. "Long as you need." Her heart thudded, not from surprise, but from how easily the words settled inside her, like a stone dropped in deep water. "I don't take charity," she said, lifting her chin. "That's not what I meant." He stood again, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're not some burden, your company, you're good to have around." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she limped back to the chair near the window and lowered herself slowly. Outside, the mesquite shadows stretched long across the dirt, and a hawk circled above the river bend. "You don't know what I'm like when I'm well," she said finally. "I'm stubborn. I talk too much when I'm nervous. I burn stew if I'm distracted." Waylon returned to his seat, picked up the half-shaped spoon. "Sounds fine to me." She looked over at him, eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're asking. I think I do." That night she lay awake longer than usual, the quilt pulled to her waist. From the other room, she could hear Waylon shifting in his bedroll, the slow creak of the floorboards beneath him. She thought of his hands, how steady they'd been splinting her leg, how gentle when he'd helped her down from the horse. Not once had he looked at her with pity. Only quiet regard, like he saw past what was broken. The next morning, she asked to sit outside. He brought a crate for her to rest her leg on and left her be while he cleaned the tack. She watched him from the porch, the way he worked in silence, his back bent over the saddle leather. There was a steadiness in him that calmed her more than any words could have. "You ever been married?" she called out. He paused, straightened a little. "Once, briefly, she left." "Why?" She wanted more than this, he said, nodding to the land around them. "More than I could give." Gwenna watched his face, but he didn't flinch, just returned to rubbing oil into the saddle, his fingers moving in slow, even circles. "I'm not looking for more," she said. He didn't answer, not right away, just kept working until the saddle shone under his hands. "I know," he said then. "That's why I trust you. By the following week, she could manage short walks between the porch and the edge of the clearing. Her legs still ached in the evenings, but the bruising had gone and the stiffness was fading. She started helping with small chores, peeling potatoes, mending a torn sleeve, wiping dust from the shelves. Waylon never hovered, but she caught him watching sometimes, especially when she laughed at herself for forgetting where he kept the spoons. One afternoon, he brought in a small bundle wrapped in muslin and set it on the table. "What's that?" she asked. He untied the knot and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a spool of thread, a length of blue calico, and a row of buttons carved from bone. "Figured you might want to make yourself something if you feel up to it." She ran her fingers over the fabric, the print faded with time but still soft. "You traded for this," had it stored away. "Meant to take it to Bisbee, but it never felt like the right time." She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "This means something to you." "It did," he said. "Now it can mean something to you." That evening, she began cutting the cloth, measuring slowly, her stitches tight and careful. Waylon read aloud from his brother's old journal, voice low and steady. She didn't catch every word, but the sound of him reading filled the cabin with something she hadn't realized she missed, the rhythm of a shared life. When the sun dipped below the hills, she folded the fabric and set it aside. Then she crossed the room and stood in front of him, her weight balanced between both feet. "I want to stay," she said. He looked up from the book, his eyes steady on hers. "You sure?" "I'm not afraid of hard days," she said. "I've had worse, but I want peace now. I think I could find it here with you." He rose from the chair, slow and quiet, and reached for her hand. "Then you ain't ever got to leave." She nodded, her throat tight, and leaned into him. He wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting lightly atop her head. And for the first time since the canyon, she didn't feel lost. She felt chosen. The monsoon rains came late that year. Thunder rolled low across the flats, heavy with promise, but the sky never opened. The ground cracked deeper underfoot, and the mesquite leaves curled dry and tight. Gwenna leaned in the doorway in the late morning heat, watching 3 quail pick their way across the edge of the clearing, heads bobbing like they were searching for something they'd lost. Inside, Waylon was sanding the table smooth. The surface had worn thin in spots, pale streaks showing where years of use had stripped the varnish. He worked slow, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the rhythm of his movements as steady as the ticking of the clock above the stove. "I could take in mending," Gwenna said. He didn't look up. "You aiming to make coin?" "I'm aiming not to sit useless while you work from sunup to dark." "You're not useless." "I said I wouldn't be idle," she answered. "I meant it." Waylon set the sandpaper down and wiped sawdust from his hands. "There's a woman in Tubac, widow, keeps a small mercantile. She might send work your way if I ask." "I'll ask myself," Gwenna said. "I'd rather earn what comes to me." His mouth tugged into the start of a grin, but he caught it and leaned back against the table. "You ride all the way there, you'll need a steadier seat than the one you took last time." "I'm not afraid of a saddle," she said. "Just need to borrow your best horse." "Only got the one now," he said. "But he's sure-footed, and you've got more grit than sense." She stepped down onto the packed earth, one hand brushing the doorframe for balance. "That's not the worst thing you've thought about me." "No," he said, voice quieter. "Not by a long stretch." It took her the better part of the week to gather what she needed for the trip. A clean dress, her repaired boots, a wide-brimmed hat Waylon had found tucked behind a trunk. He offered to ride with her, but she shook her head. She wanted to be seen arriving on her own strength. The morning she left, he handed her a small pouch. "Dried apricots," he said, "and a few coins in case you need them." She tucked it into her saddlebag. "I'll be back before sundown tomorrow." "I'll wait on the porch," he said. The road to Tubac wound through low hills and across stretches of dry riverbed. She kept the reins loose, letting the gelding pick his path, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The air smelled of dust and old iron, and the heat pressed against her back like a hand. By midday, she reached the edge of town. Tubac was no more than a handful of adobe buildings, a church with a leaning bell tower and a row of wagons lined up outside the trading post. A few children chased each other through the street, their sandals kicking up little clouds of grit. She tied the horse outside the mercantile and stepped into the shade of the awning. The door creaked as she entered, and a woman behind the counter looked up from counting flour sacks. "You're not local," the woman said, setting the ledger aside. "No, ma'am, name's Gwenna Walsh. I came to ask if you've got need of a steady needle." The woman's eyes narrowed, not unkindly. She crossed her arms. "You ride all the way from the river bend." "I did." "You the one Waylon Shaw's been keeping company with?" Gwenna braced herself. "I am. He don't bring folks around often," the woman said. "Wasn't sure he still talked to anyone who wore clean shoes." "I wear boots with holes," Gwenna said evenly, "but I can mend better than most." The woman gave a short laugh. "Good answer. I've got 2 sacks of torn canvas and a stack of seams that need reinforcing by next week. 50 cents if it's done right. I'll have it back in 4 days." The woman nodded once and turned to gather the cloth. Gwenna waited, head high, hands folded at her waist. When she rode out that afternoon, the sun was lower, the wind rising in dry gusts. She hummed to herself, a tune she half remembered from Kansas, fingers brushing the saddle horn in rhythm. She didn't look back at the town. Waylon was on the porch when she arrived. He stood as she rode in, his eyes on her face, not the bundle strapped to the back of the saddle. "You're late," he said. "I brought work," she answered, swinging down stiffly. He stepped forward and took the reins. "You all right? My knees ache and my back sore," she said. "But I made a deal." He reached for the cloth, then stopped. "You hungry?" She met his gaze. "Yes." They ate outside that night, plates balanced on their laps, the last of the daylight casting long shadows across the yard. She told him about the widow and the children and the cracked bell in the church tower. He listened, nodding now and again, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't mind if I earn my way?" she asked. "I mind if you think you need to." He paused. "But I like that you want to." She leaned back against the porch post, watching the stars begin to spark in the sky. "Seems to me we could make something here, not just survive it." Waylon reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. "I was hoping you'd say that." She didn't look away. "Then let's build it." And with the quiet night settling around them, they sat hand in hand, not speaking of past things or what had been lost, but of what could be made from the ground they stood on, something honest, something lasting. The air had changed by early August. Not cooler, but restless winds moving in from the south, carrying the smell of wet stone and creosote, though the rain still held off. Gwenna stood barefoot in the garden patch behind the cabin, her hem damp with dew, pulling up the last of the onions. The canvas sacks from Tubac were long finished and returned, and the widow had sent back more work with a jar of plum preserves tucked beside it. Waylon was away that morning, riding north to check on a fence line that had sagged near the arroyo. He hadn't asked Gwenna to stay behind, he never did, but she'd chosen to, wanting the silence to think through something she hadn't yet spoken aloud. She brought the onions inside, set them in a bowl, and poured herself a cup of chicory coffee left warm on the stove. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and the faint earthiness of drying herbs hanging from the rafters. She sat at the table, fingers curled around the mug, and let her eyes wander to the shelf where Waylon kept a small tin box tucked behind a row of tins. She'd seen him open it only once, one quiet evening when he thought she was asleep. When he came back near midday, his boots dusty and spurs clinking faintly, she was out on the porch with a needle in her hand, mending the hem of her second dress by feel. "Creek's low," he said, pouring water from the bucket into the basin. "Cattle'll have to be moved closer to the well." "You want help with that? Might need you to keep watch while I patch the gate," he said. "Coyotes have been nosing around." She nodded and set the fabric aside. "Before we go, there's something I'd like to ask you." He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, waiting. "I've been thinking on the land, on what it could be, if you'd ever considered filing for a proper claim." His brow lifted. "You mean a patent?" "There's folks in Tucson who'll help with the paperwork. If you've worked it this long, you've got a right to own it outright." Waylon rubbed a hand along his jaw. "I never stayed anywhere long enough to think about ownership. You've stayed here. Only started feeling like it mattered once you came." She stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "It matters now. We could do more with it." Plant proper rows, maybe run a few goats come spring. He stepped down the porch steps and crossed toward her, slow, thoughtful. You planning to stay long enough to see spring? She met his eyes. I was hoping you'd ask me to. He didn't answer right away. Just reached out, thumb grazing the side of her cheek, eyes searching hers. Then, steady as the first breath after waking, he said, I want a life with you, Gwenna, not just the season. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the truth of it settling between them. Then let's make it ours, she said. On paper, on land, all of it. They rode to Tucson together the following week, her skirts tied for riding, Waylon's rifle strapped across his saddle. The trip took 2 days, the desert stretching vast around them, every rise and ridge familiar now. They stayed the night in a boarding house run by a retired schoolteacher with strong opinions and a kind heart, who loaned Gwenna a comb and told her she had eyes like a woman who'd survived more than she'd ever say aloud. They filed the paperwork the next morning. The clerk asked Waylon to sign 3 times, each time in the same careful hand, then handed them a folded receipt with the territorial seal stamped in red wax. Grant will be recorded in 2 months, he said. But the land's yours now in all but name. They rode out of town with the wind at their backs and the weight of something new between them, not heavy, but solid. Earned, that night as they camped outside Picacho Peak, Waylon made a fire while Gwenna sliced jerky into a pot of beans. The stars blinked overhead, and the wind had cooled just enough to carry the scent of mesquite ash and sage. You feel different, he asked, settling beside her. She stirred the beans once before answering. I feel rooted. Waylon reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I've never had that. You do now. He watched the firelight flicker across her face, and then, soft as the hush between thunder and rain, he said, Marry me. She didn't blink, didn't look away. Yes, he nodded once, as if it had always been inevitable. They sat like that until the pot boiled over and the coyotes howled far off in the dark, their lives stretching forward like the road behind them, quiet, open, and theirs alone. The morning they were married, the clouds finally broke. Rain came soft and steady, pattering on the cabin roof with a rhythm that felt like breath. Gwenna stood by the hearth, pinning her hair back with the tortoiseshell comb Waylon had given her the week before. Her dress was simple, a pale blue calico stitched with her own hands, but the neckline was edged with a piece of lace she'd brought west from Kansas, folded away so long it had yellowed at the edges. She wore it anyway. Waylon waited outside, sleeves rolled, collar damp from the rain. He'd trimmed his beard and wore his best vest, the one his brother had made him promise never to wear for anything less than something that mattered. He'd said yes to that promise, never thinking the day would come. The preacher from Tubac rode in just past sunrise, his mule plodding up the muddy path with no hurry in its bones. The man had a voice like an old fiddle, worn but still warm, and he said the words with his hands clasped tight and reverent, though he didn't open a Bible once. Gwenna and Waylon stood beneath the eaves, the rain falling behind them in silver threads, the preacher's hat dripping as he pronounced them joined. She didn't cry. Neither did he. But when she placed her hand in his, she felt every rough edge of his palm against her own and knew there was nothing in this world she would trade it for. Afterward, the preacher stayed long enough for a cup of coffee and a slice of the molasses cake Gwenna had baked the night before. Then he tipped his hat to them both and disappeared down the path, leaving behind only the prints of his mule's hooves in the wet earth. That evening, Waylon lit the fire early. The warmth filled the cabin, slow and soft, glowing against the low beams and the polished table. Gwenna set out 2 bowls of stew, thick with barley and squash, and lit the oil lamp without needing to be asked. They ate in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the quiet between them had become something solid, like the ground beneath the floorboards, always there, always holding. After the dishes were cleared, Waylon reached for the tin box on the shelf and opened it without a word. Inside were 3 items: a folded photograph worn soft at the corners, a letter with edges singed from a long-ago fire, and a small, carved figure no taller than a thumb. He took out the figure and set it in her hand. My brother made it, he said. Back when we didn't have much but time and a carving knife. She turned it over, the edges smooth from years of handling. It looked like a horse at first, but the closer she looked, the more it resembled a mule, ears long, legs sturdy. He always said a mule'll get you where horses quit, Waylon said. Said they're slow but sure. Gwenna traced the ears with her thumb. Like us, he nodded. I want you to have it. She closed her fingers around it. I will. Later they lay beneath the quilt, the window left open to the sound of rain hitting the mesquite leaves. Waylon's arm was around her waist, his breath slow against the back of her neck. She could feel the weight of his ring against her collarbone, a simple band he'd carved himself from silver traded in two-back, filed smooth until it shone. Tell me what you want, he said, voice low in the dark. She didn't hesitate. A garden that doesn't scorch by July. A milk goat that doesn't kick, a porch long enough to sit on when the work's done. He kissed her shoulder. We can build all that, I know, she said. That's why I said yes. The rain kept falling, and the world outside the cabin windows blurred into shadow and sound. Inside, there was warmth and breath, and the steady rhythm of two people who had come through all they'd needed to come through. By spring, the garden rows were planted. Gwenna rose before sunup most days, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth while the dew still clung to the beans. She traded mending for seeds, okra, corn, even a few melon vines, and Waylon had built her a chicken coop that leaned a little to the left but held firm through every wind. He spent afternoons fencing the north pasture with cedar rails dragged down from the hills, and together they led 2 milk goats home from a ranch 3 ridges east. Gwenna named them Mabel and Fern. Mabel kicked, just as she'd predicted, but Fern took to her hand without fuss. In the evenings, they sat on the porch Waylon had extended with his own hands, wide enough now for 2 chairs and a small table. Sometimes they shared coffee. Sometimes she read aloud from a book the preacher had left behind. Sometimes they said nothing at all. But she always reached for his hand, and he always held it like it was the most natural thing in the world. They never spoke much of what had come before Kansas, the canyon, the things that had been lost. But the land remembered, and so did they in quiet ways. In the way she planted her onions in high rows to keep them from flooding. In the way he checked the roof after every storm, even when the sky held clear. One afternoon in late May, Gwenna stood at the edge of the field, hand resting on the slight curve beneath her apron. She hadn't told him yet. Not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to watch him a little longer before everything changed. He was mending the gate again, sleeves rolled, sun warm on the back of his neck. She watched him straighten, wipe his brow, and glance her way. He smiled, not wide, not flashy, just the kind of smile a man gave when he knew exactly where he belonged. She stepped forward, her boots soft in the dust, and when she reached him, she placed his hand over her belly. His fingers stilled, his eyes lifted to hers. Come winter, she said. He didn't speak, just pulled her close and rested his forehead against hers. The wind shifted, warm and carrying the scent of river sage, and the world felt still for one perfect moment. And in that moment, Gwenna knew she had found everything she'd never thought to ask for. A steady man, a piece of land, and a life built slow and sure like a mule crossing a ridge, like love grown in hard soil and deeper for it. They stayed. Through flood and drought, through laughter and lean seasons, they stayed. Together, always.